Is Bridgerton a regency? Hey strangers, today we're talking about Regency England as a genre and a historical time period. And we're going to answer the very important question, is Bridgerton a regency? When I say regency, you might have an idea in your head of what that means. Jane Austen, bonnets, ballrooms, waistcoats, a little bit of Mr. Darcy.
Turn down for what?
And while all of that is part of the Regency, it's only a very, very small part. The Regency is technically a very specific point of time during the history of England. A little bit of backstory. Henry VIII, he decides to split from the Catholic Church in order to marry Anne Boleyn. He starts up his own church, the Church of England. Problem is, Henry doesn't manage to have a lot of kids. It gets super complicated. Some Catholic rulers come back and try to rule England. They decide that they will make it a law. They pass an act of parliament that said only someone who's of the Church of England can become a ruler of England. And you ended up with Germans coming over to rule England. This starts the Georgian period, named because all the kings of this time were named George. Made it easy for us. George I was not at all very British. He didn't even speak English, and he really missed Germany and spent most of his time there. George II, more integration. If you've watched Outlander or know anything about Culloden, the Jacobite rebellion stuff, that's George II. George III is that guy. Yes, that guy. Farmer George, Mad King George. He was King of England during the Revolutionary War. He had a blood disorder that caused him to, quote unquote, go mad.
I'll go mad.
So King George in his 70s, his son has him declared incompetent to rule. So they put in a regent. So King George is still alive, and for all intents and purposes, the Prince of Wales, also named George, I know it gets confusing, he's in charge. And that's what we called the Regency, period of time from 1811 to 1820. That's when King George III died, and the Prince of Wales became King George IV. King George IV was followed by King William, and then King William was followed by Victoria, who is someone you probably know. When you look at the history of England, you are looking at the Georgian period, followed by the Victorian period, named after the Georgian kings and Victoria. And in the middle of these periods, you get the Regency. When we're talking about a political period, that time when George, the Prince of Wales, was technically in charge of the country while his father was still alive. That is the political regency. Now, I like to talk more about the long regency. The long regency goes from 1795 to 1825 and encompasses a lot more things. It has its own architecture and literature, its own music, dress, fashion, and it's definitely kind of this transitionary period. Jane Austen herself was writing during the long regency. She published during the Regency. She wrote a lot of her books much younger and then eventually managed to get them published. There's a whole argument, and we can talk about it later, about how Northanger Abbey and Sense and Sensibility make more sense when you position them earlier in the century. And that's another video as well. The Regency was not a golden age, it's very much a romanticized time period. It's also a time of highly stratified society. Definitely have tiers. There are tiers. While the Regency is cravats and waistcoats, it's also a fascinating time in history. If you are British during the long Regency, like Jane Austen was, you're living through a ton of changes. You have the Revolutionary War. It starts in 1776 and ends in the 1780s. That is threatening monarchies. The French Revolution starts to make the British people agitated about democracy, social issues, and about morality. Just across the channel, noblemen and women getting guillotined, making everyone who has a lot of money and a title in England very, 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 very nervous, thinking that could happen to them. If we just look at 1811 to 1820, you can kind of get a good idea of type of anxiety and political upheaval that was going on. The Americans started another war with the British, the War of 1812, which lasted till 1815. There are a ton of strikes and riots. You have Luddite uprising, the actual Prime Minister of England being assassinated, the Cato Street conspiracy, a conspiracy to literally kill all the cabinet members. So you have a populace that is not happy, a government that is really worried that they're going to become like France. There was a lot of censorship at this time. There was so much going on in the Regency that is not always captured in the literature. Because she was writing in her time period, Jane Austen could not come right out and say anything super subversive. She had to be very careful about what she wrote. That has contributed to our feeling that the Regency is a simpler time, because Jane Austen had to bury all that stuff. People say that the most quintessential Regency novel is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And Frankenstein, which is a horror story, really captures what's going on in Regency society. Now that we've talked about the history, let's dive into the genre of Regency, a whole umbrella of literature that takes place during the Regency time period. But it's not enough to just have the book exist during the Regency. Think of something like Master and Commander. If you're writing a story about being on a ship and fighting Napoleon, or being in Vienna and fighting Napoleon, or being in Russia and fighting Napoleon, you're probably not writing a Regency. It can't just be in the time period. Regency as a genre tends to have a few very definite characteristics. And I think for everyone, what a Regency novel is might be a little different, but these are kind of my criteria. A Regency should be set in the time period, take place in British England, not somewhere else in the empire. Regency novels are often classified as novels of manners, recreates a social world conveying with finely detailed observation the values and mores of a highly developed and complex society. Another aspect of Regency stories is attention to historical details. We want to capture the feeling of Jane Austen of living in that time period. Often is about class and or focuses on a very narrow, ultra-rich section of viscounts, earls, dukes, lords, ladies. All of those people are going to feature. You can often tell a novel is Regency just by the title alone. I always find this very interesting because Jane Austen herself never wrote about these people. She focused on the kinds of people she knew, people just below the aristocracy. So let's go back to our original question. Is Bridgerton a Regency? Yes. Kind of. Yes. Okay, fine. It's a Regency. It is set in the time period. It has a duke. Definitely ultra wealthy people. It incorporates many historical elements. It does, though, lack some of the other characteristics of Regency stories. It feels more like a soap opera than a Regency. Nothing wrong with those, for sure. I've watched many. It is not super concerned with history at all. It's not very historically accurate. I like that they wear bonnets, and there's no bonnets in Bridgerton.
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
No. Just no. While Bridgerton is technically a Regency, it's not the kind of Regency that I personally like or enjoy. I know a lot of people who love Bridgerton. I will definitely, if you're interested, talk more about Bridgerton, why I'm not in love with it. Thanks for letting me rant about the Regency. I enjoyed myself, and isn't that really what's most important? What are some of your favorite Regency? I would love to know. I will be talking nothing but Regency here on this channel. Okay, bye!